They would go and they would say, we want to come, live in the land of Egypt. We want to be able to raise our livestock here, things like that, just like what these guys were doing. And so what happened is you get a bunch of that happening, and then the next thing you know, guess what? You got a bunch of the similar people up there, and they just take over the area. And that's exactly what happened. Around 1750 is when the if I didn't practice it one more time, the Hyksos, right? That was a group of people who were of Semitic descent, who had come down and had taken over this area in the northern and the eastern side of the delta here, right? And they started basically just making themselves pharaohs up there. And so you had all these guys down here in Egypt proper, right? And they looked with disdain upon these guys, but they had run them, south, really. And so there were kind of two areas going on here. And I've got a map, and it's in your book as well. Pull this off. We got this. And so you can't see that. Let's zoom out a little bit. So you can see here the green, right? There's Thebes. That's one of the capitals of Egypt. But down here in the green, that was kind of, Egypt proper. And you can see the Hyksos, they had that area and even had, pretty big influence both south and also north, or east and north. And so they kind of took over that area and set themselves up pharaohs. And it's very possible that one of those pharaohs was one of the ones that Joseph came up under and was, able to rise to power. Oh, that's a problem. No, don't do it. Just, okay. Here's my problem. I got Microsoft stuff running on Mac. And sorry, guys. No, that's not the one I did. That's fine. Okay. Sorry. Okay. All right. So, you had the Pharaoh that was up here, right? And he was probably a Hyksos, or of the Hyksos. And he was of Semitic descent. Guess what? So was Joseph, right? And so it's very possible there was that connection that they had there. And so he was able to bring them in and set them up in the land of Goshen. Well, you fast forward a few years, right? And now, about the time... Oh, you put all of them. That's awesome. Okay. So that went on until about the late or to mid 1500s BC. And that was about the time the Egyptians said we've had enough, right? And they actually came down from the south, remember, because it's higher elevation. So they came from Upper Egypt and went to Lower Egypt, right? And kicked these Hyksos out and took the place back over. And then you can see here they started doing that in phases. And, really the Egyptians went all the way up and started pushing these guys out because the Hyksos had taken over even a lot of the land of Canaan at this point, or at least had strong influence there. That happened around 200 years later. Well, guess what? That is the explanation for in Exodus 1, where it talks about there came up a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, right? If you look in Exodus 1 verse 8, there arose a new Pharaoh, or a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them. Right? So it's very possible that there was a switch in the power there, and so they were just purging everybody, right? And the Israelites were one of those groups that they had to get under control, so to speak. Does that make sense? So you can see here, right? Around this time of 1550, that's when that started. And then you start to see these campaigns into Canaan, and you start to see references to names that are really fun to pronounce. Names like Amos. That could be, some scholars think that that's the Pharaoh who did not know Joseph in Exodus 1. And he was the main driver of pushing out the Hyksos and making those conquests into Canaan. I mean, you can see one of the temples that's here. I mean, look how far back that is. I mean, that must have been a massive structure that they had built. I cannot imagine what it was like to go into a place like that. At the same time, in the 19th dynasty of Egypt, you had the Hittites, and we've mentioned them before, but the Hittites were this growing empire in Anatolia. Anatolia is kind of like Asia Minor. And so they had started to move southward into Canaan, where the Egyptians had made conquests earlier. Maybe that's my last slide. I thought I had one more. I did. I mean, I didn't, but I had one more map. That's what it was. And so over here, you've got the Egyptians, and you have the Hittites, and you can see there's this battle brewing. And in the middle of it, there's also this kind of smaller nation called the Mitanni. And they don't get referenced a whole lot, but there was a lot of fighting with them as well. And you can see just, how all this is kind of converging there. And so eventually the Hittites and the Egyptians, they drew up a peace treaty and were able to kind of work things out so that their boundaries were more stabilized. But they were at odds for a good period of time there. And this all sets the stage, right? I mean, the whole point of this is setting the stage for the book of Exodus, right? If you don't know what's going on with Egypt during this time, you can still get a lot of good lessons from the book of Exodus. But does this kind of inform you a little bit more of like, why would this king be this way? Why would that king be that way? Why was there such a switch in terms of how they were treating the Israelites? And this is why. I mean, there was a power struggle going on in that nation. And so, just like before, when we talked about Abraham and Abraham leaving and going down to the land of Canaan, and part of the reason he did that was potentially because of Sargon the Great. Sargon the Great was taking over, right, and building up Assyria and making this push this way. And during that period of expansion and growth for the Assyrians, that's when God said it's time to get out. And he sent them out. And in the same way, right, they were perfectly content being down here until you had all this power struggle going on and God said it's time to get out. And so that's what happened. They started to make that push to make the move into Canaan. And so that sets up the book of Exodus here. So with that, we'll talk next time about two things. We'll talk about the Exodus and the conquest. So if you've already read the book of Exodus, fantastic. If you haven't, just again, when I say read these books, I know that's ridiculous, right? I'm saying look at subheadings if your Bible has them, and just anything that has to do with like law and things like that, just kind of gloss over those. Look more for the historical side of things and just the events that happened. Look over Exodus, and then also you might even dive into a little bit of like Numbers and all that, because we'll start talking about the conquest as well. Thank you very much. Sorry for the technical difficulties.